Hello, everybody. Welcome to SETI's second annual, hopefully, Enchanted Technology Festival. I am so delighted to welcome Sophie Wong, this incredibly multi-talented, sort of brilliant artist, designer, hacker. I'm not even too many labels. Sophie spoke last year at the first year, and people were really excited and wanted to have her back. And that was sort of the question I get: Will she be back this year? Will she be here? We are lucky enough that she had a brief time to speak. So I want to tell you a little bit about her work. Sophie's going to be talking about 3D printing a little bit more and costumes, but she uses this combination of design, fabrication techniques, laser cutting, 3D printing, and technology, focusing on the human body. She is an incredible educator, written tutorials and based on her work, and taught workshops, and speaks at conferences. She documents all her work and shares it really generously on her YouTube channel, her book, Wearable Tech Projects, and on her website, sophiewong.com. Sophie, thank you so much for sharing your latest project with us. And I look forward to hearing more about it and all of the other work you're doing. Those of you who are following on the stream, do post comments. After Sophie talks, there will be time for question and answers and a conversation. Those of you on the Discord also post thoughts and ideas and questions there. So take it away, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Nandini. It's awesome to be back. And yeah, let's just get started. That's such a great introduction. Thank you, Nandini. So I'm Sophie Wong. I'm a maker and a designer, and I really like to make expressive, I call it expressive wearable technology. And I have a whole bunch of slides to show you. So maybe we'll pop those up now, and I will just disappear into a little window on the side and you can see my pictures. Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. So yeah, this is the kind of work that I like to do. I call it expressive wearable technology because I realize that wearable technology is a huge term, and the kind of work that I like to do is communicative and really sort of oftentimes visually communicative. So my work takes the form of costumes, fashion, art, but I really think of myself as a designer first. And costumes, fashion, art, wearable technology, I think of those as the mediums that I like to work in. And really, I just like to integrate technology into my work in different ways. Often I will use technology in my process. So as Nandini mentioned, I do a lot of 3D printing in my work. I do a lot of laser cutting. I'm learning how to use a CNC mill right now. And I use a lot of software in my process because my background is actually graphic design. So I'm really comfortable with a digital workflow. I did a lot of graphic design before I moved into fashion design and more physical wearable construction. So I really feel like I'm at home when I'm working in programs like Illustrator or Fusion. And it's really exciting to me that I can use that kind of those skills, that I can transfer those skills into creating the kinds of things that I like to make now. So all of the costumes and fashion and art pieces that I do usually incorporate some kind of digital fabrication element. And recently I've been working a lot with 3D printing on fabric. So this is a piece that I have a video about on my YouTube channel. And this is a jacket that uses 3D printing on fabric to, I use that technique to create those hexagonal diffuser panels on the back and on the shoulders of the jacket. And then I integrated some lighting into them as well. So here's a look at that jacket. So you can see those hexagonal shapes. Those are actually 3D printed PLA. and I printed them directly on this nylon mesh fabric. So let me explain a little bit about this technique, because this is what I really want to talk about today, because I'm really excited about it, and I've been working with it a lot. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's super cool. I assume that people that are watching this probably have some familiarity with how regular FDM 3D printer works. This kind of process uses a really common FDM printer. So basically you start with a model like this, which is just separate hexagonal shapes, 3D shapes, but they're all separate in this, in the way I've 3D modeled them here. And if you were to 3D print this like normal, just pop this on your 3D printer and print it out, you would get a whole bunch of separated hexagons. But for 3D printing on fabric, you actually will lay down the first layer of the print, pause that print, insert a layer of nylon mesh fabric. This is like tulle, which is what they use to make like ballet tutus and petticoats and stuff like that. You can lay down this piece of nylon mesh after the first layer of the print, and then resume the rest of the print, and it gets sandwiched between the first two layers of your print. And then when you pull this print off the bed, the hexagons aren't separated anymore. They're now connected by this flexible piece of fabric. So you have now decorated your fabric in a way that is actually going to change the behavior of that fabric now, because now you've introduced some areas that are rigid. You're still making use of the flexibility of the fabric, but you are controlling it through the application of your design, which is super interesting to me. So here's another look at a 3D model with slightly different shapes. And here's what it looks like when I've printed it out on fabric. And you can kind of see how it's flexible, how it's sort of slinky in one dimension, and then across the other dimension, because I have fewer divisions, it's going to bend differently. It's going to be a little more rigid. So it's really fun to play with this kind of technique. I did not invent this technique, by the way. There are several other people, many other people in the maker world using this 3D print on fabric technique and playing with it and making really cool stuff. And when I learned about it, I learned about it from other people in the maker world sharing their processes and their projects. And I was like, I've got to try that. So I basically just started doing a whole bunch of test pieces, small pieces like the one I was just showing you, and just trying lots of different shapes, different spacing, and different dimensions of prints, and just really trying to wrap my head around what I could get out of this technique and how the behavior of the material was going to be affected by my design choices. And I spent quite a little bit of time learning how to model these things, or developing, my own kind of process for modeling these and playing around with them. And I decided that I really wanted to see if I could apply this to an actual complete wearable project. I really wanted to go beyond these little small scale samples. So I decided to kind of challenge myself to make a complete garment. And so I made this dress. So this is a 3D printed, this is a dress that I made completely with this technique of 3D printing on fabric. And I initially had a lot of ideas that I wanted to add to this. I really wanted to have electronics in there. I wanted to, I basically had some really large ambitions when I dreamed up this project. But when I started working on it, I realized that just scaling it up was going to be challenging enough. So I decided to really commit to just using this 3D printing on fabric technique and see what kind of challenges would arise from just expanding it out to a larger piece. And I found a lot. I learned a lot from scaling this up. First of all, I had to figure out how to model this, how to 3D model something with this much surface area, way beyond the surface area of what my 3D printer is able to print in one go, you know, and the amount of bodies in this 3D model file, it's kind of off the charts. I mean, for something that is not even mechanical, the amount of bodies that I'm working with in this 3D file in Fusion 360 was way too much for my computer to handle at the time. So I had to break it up into several files. I had to develop a workflow for going from a physical form on my dress form to going into the digital world, modeling in keeping in mind the sort of garment fabrication techniques while I was 3D modeling it in this really digital kind of mechanical space. I had to figure all of that out for the first time. I had to figure out how I was going to combine pieces together. And I tried several different things. And what I settled on was using my 3D pen to kind of weld the pieces together on the backside. And this allowed me to create a really seamless joins. And the size of my printer, it could only print about 10 inches by 10 inches if I'm leaving room to actually tape my fabric on the print bed. So the entire dress is made up of panels that are, you know, no bigger than that. So I had to use my 3D pen to connect all of those together. And I had to figure out how to deal with the practical aspects of creating an entire garment with this material. And so weight came into play. This is like 2.5, maybe 3 spools of filament. So, I mean, give or take some for things that didn't work out, but it's a lot of weight. And I'm basically suspending that weight on this very, very thin nylon mesh material. So I had to come up with ways to stabilize it, to strengthen it. And I ended up basically building the whole thing over a silk layer. Also, the nylon mesh is transparent. So for a practical, I'm using the word practical kind of loosely here. For a practical garment, you know, you want it to be opaque. So the sort of silk lining layer serves that purpose as well. And it's also for comfort, because I discovered, you know, wearing printed plastic pokey angular shapes is not super comfortable on your soft, you know, curvy flesh. So these are things that I could have hypothesized about when I was working in the small scale, but encountering them in a large scale and realizing that you're going to have to figure out a solution for these issues and then implementing those solutions, it's so different than just thinking about it, you know, beforehand. I had to figure out how to incorporate garment function, like regular functional garment features, like a zipper. And this zipper took me so many tries. I had to put it in by hand. It's an invisible zipper, and I'm actually very proud of how it lines up. But that was incredibly tricky. All of the sewing that I had to do on this garment to actually construct it and put it together, everything was really limited by the added dimension that I was bringing into the material, and the limits that were put on it by the way I was limiting the flexibility of it. So yeah, scaling up a technique like this, it very quickly reveals all kinds of challenges. And, you know, like I said, I could have thought about these. I did wonder about these things when I was doing tests, but it's so different when you actually get your hands dirty and, you know, are actually trying to bring this thing into existence, into the physical world. And I learned so much from doing this one dress that I realized I needed to do more complete projects with the 3D printing on fabric technique so I could learn more. So I just really wanted to keep going. So in the interest of going beyond the experiments, I kind of challenged myself to do 3 more pieces that were a different form factor from that dress. So I could encounter more of these challenges and develop more of my own techniques to conquer them. So the first one is this headpiece, and I do have these pieces, most of these here with me. So afterwards, I'll maybe we'll go back to just me, and I'll show these live. But this is basically a headpiece that I made that is it's kind of a cross between a helmet, like a soft helmet, or a wig, or a headdress. I'm just calling it a headpiece. I kind of like when my projects are not really like definable by one word. I think that's kind of interesting. And the filament on this is dichromatic filaments. It's really interesting filament that is actually 2 colors. The filament itself is yellow on one side and pink on the other side. So as you print it out, your print has like a directional color. It's almost like a grain in wood, or like a nap when you talk about fabric. You know, it has a visual direction. And this is the same technique of using the nylon mesh as the substrate. And the whole thing is sewn to a silk backing layer, similar to what I did for the dress. But I'm now using it in just by nature of moving to a different part of the body. I'm encountering different shapes, different challenges, different wearability issues. And this was a really good test of some of the processes that I developed on the dress. So I'll go through a little bit of how I developed this. So I started the same way that I started on the dress, which is I started by doing some physical patterning. So this is just wrapping up my my head form, my little wig form, to develop a pattern. And this is my typical process for working with in all of these pieces. I will take that pattern apart and scan it into my computer and start creating patterns, visual patterns that I like in Illustrator or in Fusion, whatever I feel like working in that day. I find that Illustrator is really I feel more comfortable working sort of more organically and freely in Illustrator. And, you know, Fusion is way more suited to doing mechanical precision. So I might choose a different program based on what I want to get out of it that day. These are patterns that I was testing out that I developed in Illustrator. And I basically I do a lot of printing out on paper, cutting it out and just mocking it up and looking at it in the real world. And this is really important for me because I can't really imagine in my mind very accurately what I'm going to get out of my machine if I'm looking at something that's just in 2D. I mean, it's in 3D in my computer's brain, but when I'm looking at that on my flat screen, it's just really hard to grasp what you're designing. So mocking things up on a physical form is a very integral part of my process. And then I did a lot of print tests. You know, this actually did not, you can see how narrow and thin the shapes initially were that I was printing out, and that did not work well. My printer had a lot of trouble with all of those retractions. I wasn't liking the look of it, but I had to go through these phases and I had to go through all of this. This is hours of printing to just test out this idea. But I had to kind of see this much of it to realize what direction I wanted to turn in. And so this is the part of my process. I pin it to the muslin and I check it and I make revisions and I just keep revising. And since I was working in this new material, this dichromatic filament, which is called quantum, this particular product is called Quantum PLA from Matter Hackers. And because it has this kind of grain nap quality, I needed to understand what I was going to get out of it from, as it was laying down on my printer. It matters what direction your model is in because of this, sort of nap quality. So I needed to do a bunch of tests to figure out how I wanted to print all of my pieces. And you can see here, this is sort of a central piece that runs down the top of this headpiece. As I'm kind of pivoting the camera around it, you can see how the colors sort of change from one angle to the other. And I really wanted to see if I could apply this technique, apply this color quality intentionally across the piece. So I kind of split my piece in the middle, thinking about the symmetry of it. And I printed all of the pieces from one sort of hemisphere in one direction and all the other ones in another direction. So, I attempted to make them sort of, the color be sort of a symmetrical, like mirrored sort of application. And it kind of worked. It looks really interesting at the very least. I really like this kind of, the way this filament sort of highlights all these shapes. Oh, but what I wanted to say about that image is I'm just checking the whole time. I'm printing things out. I'm going back to my physical form and checking it. And this is like a really integral part of the way that I work. It's like going from physical to digital, back to physical, back to digital. And I just try to keep those worlds as tied as I can, because it's really easy to spin off in one. And then when you come back, you've lost your way and it doesn't work anymore. So that's just a constant struggle. So here's a look at the model for one of the pieces, and you can see the sort of dimensionality of it. I wanted to get a little deeper than what I was doing on the dress, which the dress had pretty short, flat pieces. And I wanted to see if I could really take advantage of that 3D aspect of 3D printing in this piece. Here's what it looks like in the slicer. So this piece, this one portion of it was a 9-hour print. And, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's, the whole thing was probably about 60 to 70 hours, not including the prints that failed and I had to reprint. But here's that piece printed. And again, you can see that sort of iridescent, directional color. It's really entrancing. And here's all of the pieces that make up the headpiece. So see that they all lay flat, and I designed them all flat in Fusion 360. But when I put them all together and piece them together, they snuggle up against the head form, and they drape in a really beautiful way. And I did end up cutting the side pieces apart, sort of like, to kind of move more like separate pieces of hair. And it's really interesting how it kind of moves. But basically, this is, again, the same kind of construction technique. It's the outer layer is all connected together with the 3D printed layer is completely connected together with the, I'm using my 3D pen to connect all these panels. And then I have a black silk underlayer, which is the stabilization for that top layer. And I'm just hand sewing the top layer to the bottom layer. And it's really tedious sewing, by the way. It's so hard to get your needle to like slide in between these really dimensional pieces. But I think it's worth constructing it this way because this keeps these two pieces removable. I can easily snip all that hand sewing apart if I need to clean or repair that silk underlayer or do any repair to the 3D printed pieces on top. Sort of hand sewing is like a semi-permanent connection. It's very easy, and it's very easy to reverse, and it doesn't do any permanent damage to the pieces. So I really like sewing them together like that. And here's the finished piece. It's sort of Astro Boy, kind of Fifth Element inspired. But again, I didn't like really dwell on the I didn't go too deep on like the visual messaging or meaning behind this piece. This is really an experiment to see what kinds of learnings I would get out of applying this technique in this way. So I wanted to do another piece. So I wanted to do a piece that included some technology, some electronics. So I decided to make a necklace, and this piece I really wanted to do with even more dimension. So this is a very tall print. And again, I'll pop out into the full screen version later and give you a live look at this piece, but you can see already how deep it is. And this is just translucent PLA filament, and printed on tulle as with all of my other pieces. And it's kind of got an interesting like sound quality, which I'll show you later. But I also wanted to try, instead of starting with the physical patterning that I usually do, which is just more of a traditional like draping on the form technique, I wanted to try actually creating the base pattern for this in software. So I designed the footprint of the collar in a program called Clo 3D, it's actually a program that's for apparel design and fashion design. And so this is a very simple first kind of patterning project for me in this program, but it did save several steps for me. And I do want to become more proficient in this program because I think it is very powerful for what I do. But what I did was I designed this kind of base collar, printed it out, and cut it out, and just sort of checked it on my form, and it fit perfectly, which was really great. But then I decided I wanted to like modify the shape a little bit, and it was just quicker and easier for me to just do that on paper. So I'll be spending more time with Clo later to get better and faster at it. But again, this is my same process of printing out, scanning back in, printing out, checking it, scanning back in, and rinse and repeat. But I basically am deciding at this beginning part of the process where I want my lighting to be and kind of just designing around that. So I ended up designing this base shape in Illustrator, and again, printing it out, checking it on the form, and just kind of, I realized that if I can think about my forms in terms of footprints, and then it kind of helps me move quicker in this initial design phase, because I can take advantage of how quick it is to prototype in a 2D format versus having to 3D print things. And it's also less wasteful because I can just use paper to mock these things up. So once I was happy with those footprints, I knew that I could just extrude them out and sculpt them in Fusion and make them look like whatever I wanted. But I had a really good handle in my mind of the kind of space that I was working in. So I modeled this in Fusion 360. And here it is in my slicer. So this one is definitely over 60 hours of printing, and it takes up my entire print bed. But I can print it all in one go, and I don't have to connect anything together. So that's why I kind of wanted to use this piece, this format for this piece, because I thought, oh, this is going to really simplify my experiment here. Here it is. On the left, you can see it's sort of halfway through printing, and you can really see that dimension building up on the Z-axis. And on the right is, that's how tedious it is to get this thing off of the bed. Every single one of those little plates, they just grabbed on so well, which I'm happy about, because it's always a challenge to get things to stick when you're 3D printing. But this piece was also very heavy, so it has a really interesting kind of physical, some physical properties. You can kind of see it jiggling on the left there. But here's what I do. Every time I get a piece into another state, I check it against where I was, like, does it fit the way I thought it was going to fit? Is everything lining up? And is everything going to go together the way I thought it was going to go together? And that every step is like this opportunity to kind of fix anything before it gets too off track. And again, I wanted to stabilize this. So the pieces, those silver plates, they're all printed on that same very, very thin nylon mesh fabric. And I'm really liking this technique of backing that fabric with something more stable and more with a bit more strength. And silk is very strong, but it's also a comfortable layer against the skin, and it's easy to work with. So I'm really liking using silk as like a base layer for these projects. In this case, it also is a way for me to house the circuit that's going to light up those little circles. And so the nice thing about having this sort of digital and physical process is you have a lot of tools at your disposal for mocking things up and testing things out. So I could go right back to the pieces that I was printing out to check my fit when I was developing the 3D model. I could use that same footprint to create my circuit and to build it so that it would fit perfectly into the piece that I had just printed. So these little digital building blocks become really useful throughout the whole process of creating a piece like this. And these lights are individually programmable, so I can make them any color I want. I can give them, an interesting animation. It's got a little microcontroller hidden in the back that I can reprogram at any time. And I have this piece powered by just AAA batteries. So it's very simple. If I wanted to loan this out to someone to wear, they wouldn't have to, learn how to use a LiPo battery or anything that they were unfamiliar with. So it's I think it was a good challenge for me to just scale up a little bit, like incrementally in that dimensional axis, and really think about how to make these pieces more practical. This is definitely more wearable than the dress that I made initially. This is way more comfortable. It's, easier to put on and take off. And so I'm feeling kind of more successful in the pieces that I'm getting out of it. Like, I don't think I could send my dress to anyone to just wear. I just don't think it would survive that or be a comfortable experience for that person. But this piece, I definitely think I could do that with. So the last piece I'm going to talk about today is this glove. And this was something that I really wanted to do as sort of the kind of ultimate challenge for me right now, because I think of a hand as being, it's a very complex part of the body. A glove is a really complex piece of clothing. And so it brought a whole bunch of other challenges to it. And I think it also is a really good place to showcase what you can get out of this 3D printing on fabric technique, because there are so many curves and bends and there's so much flexion in your hand. It really does kind of show off, what this material is doing. So, but with that in mind, I decided for this first attempt at a glove that I was going to kind of give myself a pass on the fingers and concentrate more on, the larger surface areas of the glove, because that is definitely a less, the flatter surface areas kind of lend themselves better to the process as I'm doing it right now. So I decided to build it on top of an existing glove so that I wouldn't have to deal too much with the fingers. And I built an outer glove that slips over an inner glove that's purchased. So the white leather glove, the fingers you can see are the white purchased glove. And then the black area, I'm looking at the image on the right on your screen, the black area is where I decided I was going to build that over glove. And then, so what you're looking at right now is just sort of mock-up, kind of piece together visual ideas of what I thought I would create with this technique for this project. And I will often kind of collage on my work table, just kind of put things together visually, quickly, take a photo, do another one, take a photo, and kind of create like 3D sketches and this is where my samples come in really handy, because I can throw the sample on there and just kind of visually look at it and get an idea in my mind of, what kind of shapes and pieces might work together. It's just kind of a quick way for me to visually iterate. And same thing with the LEDs. I'm like kind of mocking up ideas for where I could put lighting. And these are very thin silicone coated LED strands. So they're kind of like little light noodles. They're really flexible and they're really easy to power. They're not programmable. You just power them with 3 volts. And they're really, really interesting. I want to play with these a bit more. There's sort of, I think what they're really used for are those sort of fake Edison light bulbs. They're like LED light filament, but I'm just figuring out kind of interesting ways to integrate them into my pieces. And I thought I could just kind of snuggle them between the dividing lines of my 3D prints. So I just kind of widened my lines a little bit to make them fit where I wanted them to go. And then once I kind of had a good idea what I wanted to do, I started printing test pieces. And you can see the shiny white side is actually the bottom layer of the print. So I'm printing on a mirror on this printer, and the mirror is basically very, very flat glass. And that imparts a very shiny surface to the print. And I really wanted to use that in this glove to give it sort of a really like a feel of like a high degree of finish. So you might not look at it and immediately think 3D printing, because it's kind of hides those lines. And I'm just getting really comfortable with my workflow, going back and forth with this digital workflow, physical workflow. So here's more of that printing out on paper, checking the lines, drawing them with a physical pencil, scanning them back in, changing my file, printing it out again. And it seems like, well, why couldn't you just, do all that design on the computer? But honestly, the magic doesn't happen for me in the computer. Like, I have to see it, be able to step back from it, be able to flip it around in my hand to really understand what it is that I'm making. So here's a look at the file in Fusion 360. I think it's about 800 bodies, 750, something like that. And I kept most of it very short, very low on the Z height, because I thought that for your hand, for all of that flexion, I didn't want to have any of that movement be restricted by making the print 2-dimensional. So most of this is pretty short. But in this slide, you can see all of that black. So this is the back of the prints after all of them have been assembled together. And the black areas are where I've welded the pieces together. And I did that because the underglove is black. So that way, when you flip it over, if any of that PLA that I've scored it on there is visible, it'll blend into the black background. But you can see that the front of the glove is many pieces put together, and the back of the glove is printed pretty much in one piece. I think that corner in the top right is actually just a repair that I had to do. Oh, and about repairs, it's kind of fun, because if I decided I wanted to fix something or change something, I could cut this piece along any of those dividing lines, go back into my 3D model, change that area, reprint it out, and then connect it back in, and it's completely seamless. And so it's just kind of an interesting ability that you get when you have this kind of digital memory of the design process that you've gone through. So yeah, this is the complete outer layer, and I'm just flipping it over here, and you can see how kind of slinky and floppy, and how much movement you really get in the material when it's thin and light like that. It's really interesting, and it makes for a very flexible glove. So once I had that whole piece kind of printed out, put together, and I completed it, and this is the same technique that I did on my other projects. I created it as a whole piece, slipped that over the outer glove, the black glove, and then hand sewed it on at the side seams. And that makes a really solid glove that's well constructed and is going to hold together. But again, I can get in there and take it apart if I ever need to. So here is the glove after it's sewn together, but before it has the lights put in it. And yeah, it has this kind of weird, like, it almost is like a sequined glove in the way it feels. But it's actually pretty light too, because I kept it so thin. And you can tell where I'm going to put the lights because those little dividing lines are a bit wider. So here's the lighting going in, and when I'm adding the lighting and I'm using these silicone lights, I'm also using this very, very thin silicone coated wire, stranded wire. And you can actually sew with this stuff. So I just put it in a giant needle, and I poked a hole in my glove and just sewed that wire through the glove, pulled it through, and anchored all of these LED strands with invisible thread. So I couched all of these strands into place by just sewing around them with monofilament. And it's pretty much invisible, but you get that nice light quality. Oh, here on the left, you can see me poking that hole. Yeah, it would not go in by itself. I had to make a hole big enough for it to go into, but once I did, it worked great. And the fingers, like I said, I wanted to kind of focus for this first glove on just the body of the hand. But I did want to do something interesting for the fingers. So I traced them and I created just some flat shapes that I could print in TPU filament, which is flexible. And then I adhered those to the glove, to that leather glove. So it gives it a little bit more like visual interest. And I've always wanted to try this technique to see if I could actually apply TPU to the fingers of a glove. And it actually worked fine. My plan was to just glue them in place and then hand sew them down. But the glue that I used actually is holding it really well. So I'm just kind of leaving it for now. And I know I can sew them down if I need to. That's why the shapes are kind of open. But for right now, they're holding in place just fine. And the TPU is very flexible. So yeah, every layer, except for the glued on fingers, every layer here is removable, repairable, and replaceable. And it's just, the lights are powered with a really simple 3-volt coin cell battery. And here you can really see how flexible those fingers are. So for the amount of 3D printing that is applied to this glove, when you're wearing it, it's really comfortable, I have to say. So I only made one side, by the way, because this was such an experiment. But now that I did finish that, I definitely want to make the other side. And I kind of want to make a suit to go with this, because I feel like I can see in my mind the kind of suit like what that suit would be. And obviously there would be a lot of challenges I would encounter there as well. So that's exciting. But yeah, I do feel kind of drawn to blow up this project into an even bigger garment. So that's it. So those are 3 complete projects that are basically taking this idea of, or this technique of 3D printing on fabric, but applying it in different ways to different areas of the body. And each area it brings in a different amount of complexity and scale and different challenges, and just allowed me to like refine my workflow and develop like new processes and try some new things. So they all taught me so much, and they gave me a lot more ideas of other things that I want to pursue and try. So definitely more coming there. And that's it. That's all I have to show for today. And these are all the places where you can see sort of the things that I work on. And you can ask me questions there if you don't get them in today. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Maybe we'll both jump back on. Hello. Yeah, we're back. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was incredible. And I think people watching and I just appreciate how you walk through process, and you know, often we see the finished product and we see the vision, but we never get to see the, like, you know, here are things I tried, and the realization that it takes a huge amount of persistence and creative sort of experimentation to get to a final outcome. So that was incredibly helpful.
Good.
I want to ask a little bit about how you ended up here and your path into this. I think people were a little curious. How were you always a fabricator? Were you an engineer? What was your path into how you ended up with 3D printing and fabrication and all of this stuff?
Yeah, it's been really wandering for me. I've always been interested in technology. I've always been interested in art, and I've always been sort of a creative-minded person. But I never thought that I could really work in technology or understand it until probably like I must have been like almost 30 before I like decided to even try anything creatively with electronics or technology. I just wasn't exposed to it as like a medium that was available to me. So like I think what I hear from a lot of other people who maybe fell into it a little bit more naturally is that they kind of took things apart when they were young. And I never did that because technology and electronic devices, they were really mysterious to me, and they were really expensive. So I didn't have any like they weren't like what's the word I'm looking for? They were too precious to explore. So I didn't do that until much later. I actually didn't know what I wanted. I still say like I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but I never like had a really clear path or idea of what I wanted to pursue. I've just kind of like discovered things and like gotten over my fear of like trying them. So in school, I discovered graphic design, and I was really fortunate because my graphic design education was, my professors really drilled into us that design is a framework. It's not a medium. It's something you can apply to anything. And so they kind of gave us this idea that, you know, we're going to study it through graphic design, but you could use it for architecture. You could use it for industrial design. You could use it for, you know, you can apply it to anything. You can apply design thinking too. So I kind of left school thinking like, well, I'm going to do graphic design, but I might not do that forever. And when I kind of got tired of doing professional graphic design, I'd always been really interested in fashion design. And so I just maybe naively was like, I'm just going to try that. So I, I kind of like took this huge leap of faith, quit my job, working together with my husband to figure out how we could do this. I quit my job and just kind of took some time off to figure out what I would do if I was going to start a really small fashion brand. And so it was great because I got to use all of my design thinking in all these different ways. I got to do the branding, I got to design the clothes, and it kind of reignited my passion for physically making things as I started sewing all the clothes and making my samples and stuff like that. And I got pretty far. I was selling things in like boutiques, but I was making everything myself, and I would have had to take that next leap to go to like factory production to do like small runs, and I was going to do it. I was close, but we ended up relocating. We ended up moving from the Bay Area up to Seattle, where I am now, and it kind of gave me this moment of like pause, where I kind of thought like, what I like about what I'm doing now is that I get to design things, I get to create them. I'm less excited about selling them, and I'm more excited about designing them and explaining them to people, like, telling them about my design ideas. So I thought, well, maybe if I don't want to sell things, but I want to design things that are like, kind of visually communicative and have meaning, isn't that like a costume? So I kind of got excited about costuming. And when we moved up here, I thought, okay, well, Seattle has a fantastic opera house. And I just wonder if they're doing internships. So I got an internship in the costume shop at Seattle Opera and started learning about costumes, doing professional costuming, and kind of at the same time was pursuing my own personal projects that were costume related, but also started integrating technology. We bought a 3D printer when we moved up here. I had just seen one of the first seasons of Project Runway, where there was a person on, I think it's the second season of Project Runway, Diana Ng, was the first person I ever saw using technology in a garment. And it totally changed my life. Like, that is the moment where I realized I could do technology, is when I saw someone doing it who like looked like me and was making the kinds of things that I wanted to make. So that was super powerful. And my husband was like, you should try that. And I was like, do you think I could? So that little bit of exposure to just the idea that I could do it was enough for me to try it and then get totally hooked. So I started making, as I was working at the costume shop. I'm sorry, this is an extremely long answer to the question.
This is perfect. This is really interesting.
It's just like all of these things that kind of came into my life at like the right time for me to be able to do something about it. I had worked professionally long enough that I had a base that I could try these things. I was in locations where I had access to these things, like, the Bay Area and Seattle, there's just technology. And even though like a lot of my friends at the time, like I don't know why I call them non-maker friends, but the people who were in my circle and in my life before I discovered that I was a maker, before I learned that word, they didn't really understand what I was doing as I was experimenting with this stuff. I'd be like, hey, I'd post on Instagram like, hey, look at these LEDs that I stuck to my hand. And, they're like, what? But when I started to find other people who were doing similar things, and kind of realizing that like applying my design sensibilities and the things that I'd learned from all the other kinds of design that I've done, they all kind of come together in like this medium that is like such a weird combination of things, And so it's kind of perfect for the way my brain thinks, because I just personally like am very eclectic. I just love to mix things up. I love multi-materials. I love like having my sewing machine there, and then I walk outside and my CNC machine is right there. Like I like all these weird juxtapositions. And I think like wearable technology is like a weird juxtaposition that just like makes sense to me, you know?
So you talked a little bit about finding both sort of resources, the technology itself, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about the maker community and how that is a sort of really powerful learning community. But when you started, and what would your advice be for people who are artists or in fashion, or who want to sort of find their way into technology and how to incorporate it into the things they care about? Where did you go about, what were your sources of inspiration, whether it's people or websites or tutorials, or how did you find your way into it?
Yeah. And I think like, and it's only been like, less than 10 years since I discovered this stuff and started working on it. And it's already like, there's so much more. When I discovered Diana Ng, she had a book. So I learned from a physical book, I bought her book, I bought someone else's book, and I literally just went through the lists in those books of like where you could get things, how to put those things together. It was I hadn't discovered the maker community that existed at that time. It was smaller then than it is now, and I didn't even know about it. So I was going through like books I could buy at like Borders, and I discovered Adafruit, which was another huge, life-changing access to resources, because not only do they have great products that actually are really dependable and high end quality, and you've got a really good chance of that thing you're getting actually working, they also are so good on documentation and education, tutorials, ideas, and so resources like that are so powerful. So it was more limited when I started, but it was still like, I couldn't believe these things were available. Like I couldn't believe you could just buy an Arduino. When I found out what an Arduino was, I was like, you can just buy that? And now it's just like incredible the kinds of hardware you can get your hands on, and not only from, big companies or even medium-sized companies, but just individuals creating products that they're made by makers. So they work for makers, I think if right now, there's so much on the internet that is free that you can get access to, which is amazing. So, technology conferences like this, and YouTubers just explaining what they're making. I think like I think it's almost like there's so much out there, it's a little overwhelming. And so identifying people who do work that is inspiring to you is really helpful, because then you can kind of work backwards from, like when I was learning about this stuff, I didn't know I was going to end up making 3D printed headpieces. I just started making things, and I was looking at tutorials that were along the lines of something I wanted to make, but I always wanted to change it a little bit to make it my own. And as I kept doing that, just modifying other people's tutorials or taking tutorials and combining them together. Like I did a whole Maker Faire talk about like taking tutorials and combining them together to like make your own thing. The more and more I did that, the more I kind of started to develop my own ideas of what I wanted to make, I didn't know that I was going to end up making wearable technology. In fact, I thought I was still kind of spread out and eclectic and doing all kinds of random things, until someone was interviewing me for something and they were like, do you have anything that you made that isn't wearable? And I was like, no. And suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, I like fit in a category now. Like, that's crazy. Like, I've never fit in a category before, but it wasn't a category that existed when I started in my mind, when I started kind of working in this medium.
So
yeah, I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
No,
I didn't mean to interrupt. Finish your thought. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna sum up by saying, like, I think the kinds of information that are out there now, it's like online tutorials. They're now like university programs that you can enroll in that actually focus on like this kind of design. And then there's, random people like me just kind of sharing like the things that I'm interested in, what I'm doing. So I don't think there's one source for anyone or one path, but it's kind of like you gotta just dig around and look for something that resonates with you and just follow it, is my advice.
So the things you make, you talked about fashion and wanting it to be sort of a brand and creating selling to boutiques. The things you're making now in technology seem like very sort of unique, sort of one-off, sort of creative pieces. And do you imagine that they are living in this world of art and sort of individual, very creative, unique pieces? Do you see it as scaling into a manufacturing process? What would you like to see with it? Whether you do it or some,
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked me that.
3D printed stuff, fabric and electronics. Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked me that, because I've been doing a lot of thinking over the pandemic of like, what do I want to do with this? Like, where do I want this to go? And I think what makes sense to me is I've kind of worked out what I do in a way that makes sense to me. And I say, it's expressive. It's expressive wearable technology. And so the kinds of purposes it lends itself to is like telling stories and communicating messages. So I would love, I'm more interested in applying my work and my design brain to telling creative stories or delivering these messages. So I think what I want to do more of is working with other creatives, like film directors. I'm doing a spacesuit right now for someone who's doing a short film. And it's super exciting because I get to design it. He's giving me his idea. He's giving me the design brief, the challenge, and I get to design it and create it and to help tell that story through this wearable technology, full body piece. And I want to do more things like that, where the work is in service of a message. So costuming, fashion, and art, all of those things, I really want to apply the work to. But I think rather than it being a sort of product in itself, I want the work to serve the message being told. So in a more practical term, I feel like it's like becoming like sort of a almost like a design agency or like an atelier for these little specific like art projects, not to create them and reproduce them en masse, but to create them as specific solutions for a specific message.
So you talked a little bit about, find out who inspires. Like, do you have a couple of different artists, creators, makers, people working in 3D printed that you are following that sort of you're really excited about it?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, for 3D printing, I mean, every day I see amazing things from the 3D printing community where I'm like, that is mind blowing that someone has modeled that and it comes out of a 3D printer. And it's just so eclectic what comes out of that community too. It's like you never know what to expect. But there are other people working in the 3D printing on fabric space that I'm definitely watching who I find really, really inspiring. There's someone on Instagram who goes by the handle Sew Printed, SEW Printed, and her work is amazing. There's David Shorey, obviously, many people in the maker community are familiar with his work. He really popularized the 3D printing on fabric technique in the maker world. And there are just other people who in the 3D printing world who I just find are really, really talented and really clever designers, like Devin Montez from Make Anything. Everything he makes, it's just a level of design that is so clever and so well thought out. I'm always super inspired by him and his work. But then I try to make sure that my inspirations are really varied. So I'm inspired by architects. I'm inspired by stage designers. I'm inspired by artists that work in completely different mediums than I do. I'm inspired by movies. And I actually have a whole board of people. So I have the problem of like, I'm inspired by everything. So I get really spread out and sometimes it's overwhelming. So I kind of periodically go through and like sort of try to edit down what's in my brain at one time. So I actually have a board around here, like a big mood board that has people who I'm currently being inspired by. And I like put people on it and I take people off of it. And they're artists and designers like the Eames, like Massimo Vignelli and Leila Vignelli, like the sort of more not traditional, but modernist designers from like design history. And then I'm inspired by like Lady Gaga and Beyonce and Lizzo. They're all on there because they're just, they are telling these visual messages in their performances. I have stage designers like, her name is escaping me right now, but there's a fabulous stage designer who has an episode of Abstract, which is on Wired. Which is made by Wired and it's on Netflix, and it's just her episode just blew me away. Ruth Carter, who's the costume designer for Black Panther and all the Spike Lee films, she's on there. Her work is so communicative and always different. Every story that she's telling, her work is custom to that story. So she is providing like her work is just I really respect that aspect of design. Like the design is in service of the message, and the message is the forcing function for everything that comes out of it, So yeah, I am inspired by lots of people, and inspiration is something that I actively spend time on. I sometimes will just carve out time to just like, I did a thing where I spent 3 days of all my free time just watching every fashion documentary I could find so that I could kind of prime my brain to think in that mode. And it's like curating inspiration is like a hobby of mine.
Oh, I love that phrase, curating inspiration. That is, I've never done that, like collected people, but now I'm definitely going to try to go and sit this weekend and think, who would I put on my board for the moment? And
it's kind of fun.
And I like that notion of sort of that research for creative sort of inspiration, as watching documentaries and finding inspiration in different places, as I think. I want to talk a little bit about there are a couple of things I want to touch on. One is like choice of materials and how sort of, before I do that, I want to say it is really exciting and important to talk about that notion of, the things you make as telling a story and having a message, and they're in service of that message. And that notion that technology is not just a gimmick to make cool things that blink or shine, but that they're telling a story, I think is something really powerful. I wanted to ask about, how do you choose materials? How do you think about the role of materials in the world, especially with technology and the environment, and sort of just muse on that for a little bit? Or is it sort of a consideration? Is it something you play with?
Yeah, materials are something that I also like to kind of collect and explore, and sometimes I'm just inspired by the material, like the like this headpiece. Really, I talk a lot about design communicating a message, but for this piece I really just wanted to like use this material and see how I could take advantage of this like really sort of iridescent quality. And so I think materials just often inspire me on their own. I choose materials based on, well, I think developing a familiarity with a material. It's like, I think if you think about it as a designer or as an artist, the more you work with a material, the more you build a relationship with it. Like you understand its limitations and its strengths, and you learn how to control it, and it becomes a tool for you. Like your knowledge of that material becomes a tool for you, and that's makes that material easier for you to work with, and so you'll select it more often. And so I've kind of fallen into, just by nature of 3D printing being a plastic focused tool, I've fallen into using plastic for these pieces. And I think that I mean, honestly, that part of it I think about a lot, because I kind of hate that. I understand from a practical perspective that obviously the amount of 3D printing going on in the world compared to the amount of plastic that's produced from just food packaging, it's not comparable. But we are so, that 3D printing as a hobby, as a thing that people do, as an accessible means of creating something, it's so young. It's such an opportunity to choose where it goes. And I think it's important for us to figure out what our relationship with plastic is going to be if we're going to keep 3D printing. And there's like no good answer right now. And I certainly am not a material scientist. I don't have answers, but I really desperately want manufacturers of 3D printing machines, 3D printer filament, I really want them to concentrate on this, because as a consumer, I just have guilt. I don't have a lot of power, but I have a lot of guilt, and there's just not a lot of options for me. But this technology is so powerful for me because it really leverages my skill set, as a designer who's comfortable working with a digital workflow. A 3D printer is so powerful. And it's a space that I'm watching closely. And I really like, if anyone watching this is someone who makes some kind of 3D printer filament that is, an experimental, sustainable material, like, I am interested. And I think I dream of a day, I don't know if it's possible. I'm like, can we print with mushrooms? Can we print with, I know there's a lot of interesting science going on with developing new materials that are more sustainable, but maybe have similar properties and, could stand in for the way we use plastic. And I'm just hoping that people who have, the people who are creating products for us to rally around, it would just be so much easier if they would pay some attention to that. I think at the very least, I would really like 3D printer filament to come on a cardboard spool. Like, I get it. The product itself is plastic, but can we just not add more plastic to it? So that's, I've gone on a tangent, but in general, the materials that I choose are the materials that I can manipulate with the processes that I'm familiar with. And I am very alert about how my understanding of a creation process limits the materials I can select and limits the design choices that I can make. So I kind of like to learn as many processes as I reasonably can so that I have a wider range of materials I can select from. So adding CNC into my toolkit is like a whole game changer, because now I can really do aluminum, I can do polycarbonate, I can do Delrin, I can do, I can do wood in different ways with a precision that I can't do with my hands. So the materials really fit with the processes, and the more processes I can learn as a designer, the more materials I have access to, and the better, I can design for them.
Yeah, and that was really good. Like that, yeah, there is, as a consumer, you often have very little choice, especially if you really care about quality and really care about how it looks in your design or how it feels, like what the properties are. But as manufacturers or researchers, like material scientists, they this is a direction it would be amazing if they went. I want to end with like one really, I think, important aspect that you've brought up many times, the maker community, both locally and nationally, and how it supports or inspires or your space in it, and especially for people watching who maybe haven't found their way into that community. How would they go about doing that, and recognizing there is this really collaborative, supportive resource out there in the world?
Yeah. So I kind of found it. Did I go searching for it? I guess I did. I think earlier I mentioned that, people who I knew who didn't understand what it is I was experimenting with, they had trouble kind of engaging with me on it. And I was really like aware of that. And I think when I really like sought out the maker community, it was through Maker Faire. And I kind of did it by just applying to do something at Maker Faire. Like, I think now you can join a Discord, like you can join the Adafruit Discord. It's really, really welcoming, and it's like the best place to ask a question about electronics, I think, because it is very respectful place. But there are lots of places on the internet where it doesn't feel respectful. So it's a little scary to like reach out and try to like join what you might think is a maker community. If, your question is met with a lot of criticism and ridicule, that like doesn't feel good. So, so I think I was maybe not ready to like post on a forum back then, but I felt like I could apply to show something at Maker Faire. I was kind of like working on my own. And I want to say this is like 2015, maybe. And I'm talking like mini Maker Faire at Seattle. And the cool thing about, and I'm sad that Maker Fairs are so rare now. Some of them are coming back, but at the time it was like a Maker Faire was, you could apply to show something. And if you were just an individual maker, it was free. Like, your booth was free. You could show up with your project, put it on a table, and just wait for someone to come out and ask you about it and talk to them. And I was really, really nervous, but I did that. And I actually applied to do a talk at Mini Maker Faire, and I didn't get in. And I think like I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about. And I didn't have, it's not that I didn't get in, it's that they offered me something else. You know, I wanted to like do like a TED talk kind of thing. And they were like, well, how about a panel? And I was like, okay. It was the greatest thing ever, because being on a panel meant I met 3 other people on my panel who were doing similar things, you know, and I'm still friends with several of them, and I'm inspired by them. And I had to kind of engage with this event in my local space to like jump in to actually like connect with the maker community. It was just easier for me that way. I wasn't like ready to, you know, join any kind of like online community or anything like that. And just through doing stuff at Maker Faire, that was enough for me to meet people, like-minded people, interesting people, that, you know, were doing types of making that I'd never even heard of before. And so, you know, maker events, maker spaces, which are so rare now too. It's just like, oh, the pandemic's been rough. But it's like there are some people who feel really comfortable engaging online and finding these spaces online. But for other people, it might be something more physical that you have to like go to in person. So I'm glad that, you know, with safety in mind, you know, we're starting to figure out how we can gather again. That's going to be really important, because, you know, we all engage in different ways and are comfortable engaging in different ways. And for me, I really had to go to a physical event to like jump into the maker community.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for sharing your process, your ideas, your suggestions, especially for people sort of stepping in and learning in the space. This is incredibly inspiring, and the work you're doing of combining so many different ideas from so many different fields, I think, is just really brilliant and beautiful. So, and creating something really powerful at the end is really magical. So thank you,
Thank you
so much
so
for
much.
joining us. And maybe we'll end the thing now and go backstage, Chris.